Hey guys, thanks again for tuning in for another week of Okay Now John. We're in our third week of our series, Conquering the Giants. If you remember, week 1 we talked about conquering the giant of opposition. Week 2 we talked about conquering the giant of fear and doubt. This week we're going to be talking about conquering the giants of circumstance and setback. If you remember our series verse, it's Romans chapter 8 verse 37 when Paul writes, "In all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." I really love that verse, as I always say, because it says we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. This week we're really going to talk about a subject that really hits home to me, and I believe it's a story that we can all relate to. So let's turn to Acts chapter 27, and we're going to be reading verses 9 through 26. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the story of Paul's shipwreck. Much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned the Roman soldiers, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So I want to pause right here and kind of point something out. This book was written by a guy named Luke, and Luke was the author of the, Gospel of Luke. And so I want to point out, he says, the majority decided that we should sail on. This is written in first person. I think that's significant because if it's written in first person, that indicates that we need to put ourselves in this story. So let's go ahead and keep going. This is verse 13. When a gentle south wind, I love that, it says, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed the anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. Verse 15, the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. Let's skip down to verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete." This is what I like to call an I told you so. This is what I like to call an I told you so. Paul's basically telling them, I told you so. I told you guys, do not sail this way. But this is what I love about Paul. After rebuking them, he then encourages them. He says, you should have taken my advice. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. Verse 22, but now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." This is really, really powerful, and the story is really good because there's two types of people in the story. There's the soldiers, and then there's Paul. Paul warned the soldiers not to sail, but the soldiers relied on their knowledge. They relied on their wisdom. They relied on their power. They rejected the wisdom of God and the wisdom of Paul, and they decided to do what they wanted to do. And sometimes not listening ends us in a bad setback. Sometimes not listening ends us in a very bad setback. It says the wind suddenly got strong out of nowhere. Often life hits us out of nowhere, right? Life can sometimes feel like a shipwreck. In fact, I'm going to say life sometimes often is a shipwreck. And sometimes that shipwreck is due to not following God's guidance. A setback, as was the case with the Roman soldiers. But sometimes the shipwreck is due to just being in a bad place at a bad time, as was the case with Paul. But here's what's beautiful about this story. Even though the soldiers were fools and Paul was wise, they both trusted in God when the storm came. This is a beautiful story because it applies to everyone. It applies to the people who make mistakes, people like me who make mistakes, but it also applies to, even though you may be walking with God, even though you may be walking righteously, you're still not spared from the shipwreck. But again, like I said, the beauty of this story is even though the soldiers were fools and Paul was wise, they both had one thing in common. When the storm came, they trusted God for their provision. Whether we are like the soldiers or Paul, we must put our faith in God for our provision. Thank you guys so much for watching this week's Okay Now John. Don't forget to conquer the giants of circumstance and setback, and I'll see you guys next week for our final devotion on conquering the giants.